Here's something that sounds impossible. You can shut a nuclear reactor completely off, stop the chain reaction dead, drop every control rod into the core in under 2 seconds, and the thing will still try to melt itself into the ground. Switching off the reaction was never the hard part. The hard part is the heat that keeps coming after. The heat that doesn't care that you flip the switch. Engineers have a name for it: decay heat. It's the reason a reactor still needs cooling long after it stops making a single watt of power. Today, you'll see why that heat is the real enemy, and what happens on the day the water stops moving. So start with the reaction, because the reaction is the easy part. Genuinely. Inside the core, uranium atoms are splitting apart, and every time one splits, it throws off neutrons that split the next one. That's the chain reaction, and it's the thing making all the power. Slide the control rods in, and they soak up those neutrons like a sponge. The chain stops, cleanly, almost instantly. If that were the whole story, a reactor would be the safest machine on Earth. You'd shut it down and walk away. But when a uranium atom splits, it doesn't just release energy, it leaves behind wreckage. 2 smaller atoms, and those smaller atoms are violently radioactive. They're unstable, and they spend the next seconds, hours, and days breaking down into other elements. Every one of those breakdowns releases a tiny pulse of heat. Multiply that by the trillions upon trillions of atoms that were splitting a moment ago, and you don't get a tiny amount of heat, you get a furnace nobody can switch off. And the question that decides whether a reactor lives or dies is a simple one. Exactly how much heat are we talking about? The instant you shut a big reactor down, the decay heat coming off that core is roughly 6 to 7% of the full power it was making a second earlier. That doesn't sound like much until you remember what full power actually is. A large commercial reactor runs at around 3,000 megawatts of heat. 6% of that is close to 200 megawatts. 200 megawatts pouring out of a core that is, on paper, switched off. That's enough energy to run a small city. And it's got nowhere to go except into the fuel and the water around it. Think about a cast iron pan. You turn the burner off, but the pan stays dangerously hot for a long time after, because the metal is still holding all that energy and letting it out slowly. A reactor core is that, except the pan is generating brand new heat from inside itself, and it's hot enough to melt steel. Turning off the stove was easy. Getting rid of the heat already in the metal is the part that takes hours. Now, here's the good news, and it's the reason nuclear power works at all. That heat drops fast. Within an hour, it's down to somewhere around 1 or 2%. Give it a day, and it keeps sliding. But it never hits 0 on your schedule. A full day after shutdown, a reactor core is still throwing off more than 1% of its full power. That's still tens of megawatts. It's the reason spent fuel has to sit in a pool of circulating water for years before it's cool enough to move. So picture what that means for the people running the plant. You can stop the reaction. What you cannot do is stop the heat. And if you can't stop the heat, you've got exactly one job left. Move it. Constantly. Carry it away from the fuel faster than the fuel makes it, without a single long interruption, for days on end. That one requirement governs everything about how these machines are built. Not the reaction, the cooling. Every reactor on Earth is basically a very elaborate system for keeping water moving over a core that refuses to go quiet. And if that idea is new to you, that a reactor being off is not the same as a reactor being safe, that's exactly the kind of thing this channel exists to pull apart. So hit subscribe and stick around, because it only gets stranger from here. So here's the real enemy, and it's almost boring. It's plumbing. Keeping water moving over a core that won't cool down. And the disaster begins on the day that water stops. Engineers have known about decay heat since the very beginning, which is why no reactor relies on a single anything. The whole philosophy is called defense in depth, and it's exactly what it sounds like. Layers. If one thing fails, another catches it. If that fails, a third catches that. Start with the water. Under normal operation, powerful electric pumps push water through the core non-stop, carrying the heat away to make steam and spin the turbines. Cut the power to those pumps and you'd think it's over. But no, there's backup. Reactors are wired to the electrical grid from two directions. Lose the grid, and massive diesel generators fire up automatically, usually within seconds, to run the pumps. Lose the diesels, and banks of batteries take over to keep the most critical cooling alive for a few more hours. Layer after layer after layer. On paper, you'd have to lose the grid and the diesels and the batteries all at the same time to be in real trouble. And that's supposed to be almost impossible. So what actually happens if the water does stop moving? This is the part worth slowing down for, because it's the whole reason the stakes are so high. With nothing carrying the heat away, the water around the fuel starts to boil. The level drops. And the moment the top of the fuel rods pokes out above the water, the temperature there climbs with terrifying speed, because now there's nothing cooling them at all. The rods are sheathed in a metal called zirconium, chosen because it's nearly invisible to neutrons. But zirconium has a dark side. Get it hot enough, past about 1200 degrees Celsius, and it stops being an innocent bystander. At that temperature, the zirconium starts ripping oxygen straight out of the steam around it. That reaction does two things, and both are bad. It generates even more heat all on its own, so now the fire is feeding itself. And it releases hydrogen gas. A lot of it. Pump enough hydrogen into a reactor building, add one spark, and you get an explosion strong enough to tear the roof off. And if it still isn't stopped, the fuel itself keeps climbing toward its own melting point, close to 2800 degrees, until the core slumps into a molten mass at the bottom of the vessel. That right there is a meltdown. A pile of switched-off fuel that cooked itself into slag because the heat had nowhere to go. Notice what didn't happen in any of that. The chain reaction never restarted. It was off the whole time. Every bit of that destruction came from decay heat and a cooling system that quit. Which brings us to the day it happened, at full scale, in front of the entire world. On the afternoon of March 11, 2011, the seabed off the coast of Japan lurched and set off the most powerful earthquake the country had ever recorded, a magnitude 9. At the Fukushima Daiichi plant, 3 reactors were running. The instant the ground started shaking, they did precisely what they were built to do. Control rods slammed into all 3 cores, and the chain reaction stopped. Clean shutdown. The safety systems worked flawlessly. The earthquake also tore down the power lines feeding the plant from the grid. No problem. That's what the diesel generators are for, and they roared to life on schedule and took over the cooling pumps. For about 40 minutes, Fukushima was a plant that had just survived a monstrous earthquake and was cooling its cores exactly the way the manual said it would. Every layer was doing its job. Then the tsunami arrived. The wave that reached the plant was around 14 meters tall. The seawall protecting Fukushima was built for something far smaller. The water came straight over the top and poured into the lower levels of the buildings. And this is the detail the entire disaster turns on. The diesel generators and the electrical switchgear that carried their power were down in those lower levels. The flood drowned them. All of them. At once. Think back to those beautiful layers of defense. The grid was already gone from the earthquake. Now, in a matter of minutes, the diesels were gone too. Every backup that was supposed to fail independently had just been wiped out by a single wave because they were all sitting in the same building, in the same flood zone. The batteries held on for a few hours in some units, and then even they ran flat. This is the nightmare with a name. Station blackout. No grid, no diesels, no batteries, and 3 cores, all still glowing with decay heat, with nothing left to move the water. From there, it played out exactly like the mechanism we just walked through, only for real. The water boiled away, the fuel was exposed. The zirconium hit temperature and started pulling the steam apart, making hydrogen. Over the next few days, the cores of all 3 reactors melted, and the hydrogen found its spark. One by one, the upper floors of the reactor buildings blew apart in hydrogen explosions, shown on live television around the world. To anyone watching, it looked like the reactors themselves had exploded. They hadn't. The reactions had been stopped days earlier. What people were watching was the sound of a cooling failure, finishing what it started. Fukushima wasn't a story about a reactor running out of control. It was a story about decay heat and a set of backups that all lived within reach of the same wave. The engineers got the hard part right. The reaction stopped. It was the plumbing that killed the plant. Now, if Fukushima was the reaction shutting down and the heat winning anyway, Chernobyl was the exact opposite, and in some ways the more frightening of the two. Because at Chernobyl, the reaction itself is what ran wild. It was April 1986, and the crew at reactor number 4 was running a safety test, of all things. The irony is almost too much. They wanted to check whether, during a blackout, the spinning momentum of the turbine could keep the cooling pumps alive for the brief gap before the diesels kicked in. A test about cooling. To run it, they had to bring the reactor down to low power. And here the design of this particular reactor, the Soviet RBMK, turned into a trap. 2 floors, both waiting. The first is a thing called a positive void coefficient. In most reactors, if the cooling water starts boiling into steam, the reaction naturally slows down. That's a built-in brake. In the RBMK, it was backwards. More steam meant a faster reaction, which made more steam, which made it faster still. A loop that fed on itself. The test went badly. The power dropped far lower than planned, and to claw it back, the operators pulled almost every control rod out of the core, leaving themselves with barely any safety margin at all. The reactor was now balanced on a knife's edge, and that self-feeding steam loop was starting to spin up. So they hit the emergency shutdown, the button that's supposed to drop every control rod at once and kill the reaction. And this is the second flaw, the one that's almost impossible to believe. The control rods on the RBMK were tipped with graphite. And graphite doesn't slow the reaction. It speeds it up. So for the first split second after the operators pressed the panic button, before the rods could do their real job, They shoved the power higher instead. In a reactor already running away, that was the end. The power surged to something like 100 times its normal maximum in seconds. The fuel shattered. The water flashed instantly to steam, and the pressure blew the top clean off the reactor. A slab weighing around 1,000 tons, straight up through the roof of the building. And here's the layer Fukushima had that Chernobyl didn't. A containment building. A thick dome of steel and concrete built around the reactor to catch exactly this kind of release. The RBMK didn't have one. So when the core was torn open and the graphite inside caught fire and burned for days, there was nothing between that burning core and the open sky. Two accidents, almost opposite in how they began. One where the reaction stopped and the heat couldn't be removed. One where the reaction was let loose by a broken design and a reckless test. But look at what sits underneath both of them. Heat, and whether you can control it. That's the whole problem of nuclear power in a single sentence. Which is why everything built since has aimed at the same target. The newest reactors are designed so that when the power dies and the pumps stop, the cooling doesn't depend on any of it. Water feeds the core by gravity. The heat carries itself away by nature, with no diesels, no batteries, no operator awake at 3 in the morning. Engineers spent decades learning one lesson the hard way. You can stop the reaction in 2 seconds. Beating the heat that comes after is the machine you actually have to build. And the story of how they finally pulled it off is where we're going next.